The massive chamber on Nexus Prime stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal and living metal, and within its curved walls stood representatives from over 3,000 different species, each one watching the small human delegation at the center podium, with expressions ranging from contempt to cold satisfaction. Ambassador Daniel Porter felt their eyes upon him like the weight of a dying star, but he kept his spine straight and his face calm as the High Arbiter prepared to deliver the verdict that everyone already knew was coming. The Galactic Council had been in session for 72 hours, debating the fate of humanity with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discussing a disease that needed to be quarantined before it could spread. "The vote has been tallied," announced High Arbiter Xyloth, a towering being made of living crystal that caught the chamber lights and scattered them into rainbow patterns across the floor. "This council is unanimous." Daniel felt Lieutenant Commander Susan Hartley shift beside him, her hand moving instinctively toward a sidearm that she had been forced to leave at the security checkpoint. And he gave her a small shake of his head to tell her that everything would be fine. "The species known as humanity," Xyloth continued, his voice resonating through translation devices in 1,000 different languages, "has been found guilty of aggressive expansion, cultural contamination, technological recklessness, and presenting an unacceptable threat to the stability of galactic civilization." A murmur of approval rippled through the assembled delegates, and Daniel watched as creatures of every shape and size nodded their heads, or waved their tentacles, or flashed their bioluminescent patches in agreement. "Effective immediately," the High Arbiter declared, "Earth and all human colonies are hereby expelled from the Galactic Concord, and the following sanctions shall be imposed. All trading rights are revoked. All navigation network access is terminated. All technological sharing agreements are cancelled, and a complete blockade shall be established at the boundaries of the Sol system." The chamber erupted in what Daniel could only describe as celebration, with delegates embracing each other and making sounds of relief as if a great burden had been lifted from their collective shoulders. "No alien vessel shall enter human space," Xyloth concluded, "and no human vessel shall be permitted beyond the Kuiper Belt under penalty of immediate destruction, and this decree shall remain in effect until such time as humanity demonstrates that it no longer poses a threat to civilized species." Daniel looked around the chamber one more time, memorizing the faces of beings he had worked alongside for 15 years, beings he had considered colleagues and even friends, and he saw nothing but hostility and fear reflected back at him. Vel Kari delegation, whose homeworld had been saved from an asteroid impact by human engineers just 3 years ago, refused to meet his eyes. The Jinthari ambassador, whose species had been cured of a devastating plague by human medical researchers, actually smiled with what looked like satisfaction. The Rilthani trade minister, who had grown wealthy beyond imagination through partnerships with human corporations, was already celebrating with a glass of something purple and fizzy. "The human delegation may now respond," Xyloth said, and the chamber fell silent with anticipation, every being present expecting the emotional outburst that humans were famous for. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped forward to the speaking platform, and he could feel 3,000 species holding their breath as they waited for the tears or the anger or the desperate pleading that they were certain would come. Instead, Daniel Porter smiled. It was not a forced smile, or a bitter smile, or even a sad smile, but rather the genuine expression of a man who had just been given exactly what he wanted, and the confusion that spread through the chamber was almost worth the 15 years of condescension he had endured. On behalf of Earth and all her colonies, Daniel announced in a voice that carried clearly through the vast space, "We accept these terms without reservation or complaint." The silence that followed was so complete that Daniel could hear the soft hum of the atmospheric processors working to keep 3,000 different species comfortable in the same room. Furthermore, he continued, effective immediately, humanity withdraws all personnel from joint projects, terminates all pending technological transfers, and cancels all humanitarian aid programs currently operating in Concord space. He turned to Susan and whispered something that made her laugh out loud, a sound that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Assembled delegates shifted uncomfortably at this unexpected display of humor. "We wish you all prosperity in our absence," Daniel said, bowing slightly in a gesture of formal farewell. "And we thank you for this opportunity to pursue our own destiny without the burden of your restrictions." High Arbiter Xyloff leaned forward, his crystalline form catching the light in a way that suggested confusion. And he asked the question that was on every mind in the chamber. "You do not wish to appeal this decision or request a period of probation?" Daniel shook his head slowly, still smiling that strange smile that made so many delegates uncomfortable. "Why would we appeal?" he asked simply. "You have given us exactly what we needed, though I suspect you do not yet understand what that means." He reached into his pocket and placed a small data chip on the podium, a gesture that made several security officers reach for their weapons before they realized it was just a data chip. "Simple storage device. A gift," Daniel explained, "containing a message that you may wish to read after we have departed, though I suspect you will not truly understand it until much later." With that, the human delegation turned and walked toward the exit, their footsteps echoing through a chamber so silent that each step sounded like thunder. As they reached the doors, one of the younger delegates, a Murthari barely out of adolescence, called out in a voice filled with confusion, "Are you not angry with us?" Daniel paused at the threshold and looked back over his shoulder at the 3,000 species who had just voted to exile his people from the stars. "Angry?" he repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. "No, young one, we are not angry, for how can we be angry at those who have simply revealed their true nature?" He stepped through the door, and Susan Hartley followed close behind, and the last thing the Galactic Council saw was the human ambassador laughing quietly to himself as if he knew a joke that no one else would understand for years to come. The data chip sat on the podium for nearly an hour before anyone dared to access it, and when High Arbiter Xyloff finally displayed its contents, a single sentence appeared on every screen in the chamber. "You needed us more than you knew, and now you will learn what it means to stand alone." The celebration continued, but something had changed in the atmosphere. A small seed of doubt that would not fully bloom until humanity showed the galaxy just how wrong they had been to let fear guide their judgment. In the shadows of the Great Chamber, the youngest species ever admitted to the Galactic Concord had just been cast out, and not a single delegate understood that they had not punished humanity, but rather set them free. 6 months had passed since the banishment, and Admiral Christopher Hayes stood on the observation deck of the carrier Resolute, watching as the last alien monitoring station powered down and went dark against the backdrop of distant stars. The blockade was complete, with alien vessels forming a ring around the Sol system that stretched across billions of kilometers, and every captain in that fleet believed they were containing a threat. Christopher smiled at the thought, because he knew something those alien captains did not. The cage they had built was facing the wrong direction. "Admiral," called out his communications officer, a young woman named Lisa Grant, who had served with him for 3 years, "we have confirmation from Houston that all personnel have been evacuated from joint research facilities." "And the last of our ships?" Christopher asked, turning away from the viewport. "The transport horizon cleared the Kuiper Belt checkpoint 2 hours ago," Lisa reported, "and the aliens let her through without inspection, just as you predicted." Christopher nodded with satisfaction, because the horizon carried something far more valuable than the refugees and equipment listed on her manifest. Something that would have made every alien commander in the blockade fleet open fire if they had known what was hidden in her cargo hold. 3,000 kilometers away, in a secure bunker beneath the city of Houston, Director Patricia Coleman stood before an assembly of the most powerful people on Earth. Presidents and prime ministers, generals and admirals, scientists and engineers, all of them gathered in a room that officially did not exist, to discuss a project that had been humanity's greatest secret for over 60 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia began, her voice steady with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for this moment. "Welcome to the first official briefing of Project Prometheus." She pressed a button on her controller, and the wall behind her came alive with images and data that made several world leaders gasp in astonishment. "For 6 decades," she continued, "the governments of Earth have secretly collaborated on technologies that we never shared with the Galactic Concord, and today I am authorized to reveal the full scope of what we have achieved." The screen showed diagrams of ships that looked nothing like the vessels humanity had been using in galactic space. Sleek and powerful designs that seemed to belong to a civilization far more advanced than anyone had suspected. "When the aliens first made contact," Patricia explained, "they gave us faster-than-light travel as a gift, believing that we would be grateful and dependent on their generosity forever. But what they did not know was that within 5 years of receiving that technology, our scientists had improved it by a factor of 3. Through the assembled leaders, many of whom were learning these secrets for the first time, despite their positions of power. They gave us energy shields," Patricia continued, "and we made them 10 times stronger. And they gave us medical technology that we enhanced beyond anything their hospitals could produce. And through all of this, we pretended to be the grateful students, while secretly becoming the masters." She advanced to the next slide, which showed something that looked like a tear in the fabric of space itself, surrounded by massive generators and monitoring equipment. "But some discoveries," she said with a hint of pride in her voice, "we kept entirely to ourselves." The room fell completely silent as Patricia explained what they were looking at: a dimensional gateway, a door to another plane of existence that the aliens had never even theorized was possible. "We call it the threshold," she said, "and it leads to a realm of unlimited energy and resources, a parallel dimension where the rules of physics are slightly different in ways that benefit us enormously." General Anthony Blake, the chairman of the Joint Military Command, leaned forward with intense interest and asked the question everyone was thinking: "How long have we had this?" 32 years, Patricia answered, and the shock in the room was almost physical. "And in that time, we have established research stations, mining operations, and even small colonies on the other side, all without the knowledge of the Galactic Concord." She turned to face the assembly directly, her expression serious, but not grim. "The aliens believed they were punishing us with their blockade," she declared, "but they have actually given us the greatest gift we could have asked for: freedom from their observation, freedom from their restrictions, and freedom to become what we were always meant to be." Over the following weeks, the transformation of human civilization began in earnest. Factories that had been secretly built underground came online, producing ships and equipment that would have seemed like magic to the alien blockade fleet. And recruitment centers opened across the globe as young men and women signed up to explore the new frontier. In orbit around Earth, the shipyards that had been hidden inside hollowed-out asteroids began final assembly on a fleet of vessels that would change everything. Lieutenant Kevin Shaw stood in the construction bay of the largest shipyard, watching as robots and human workers swarmed over the hull of a ship unlike any that had ever flown in known space. "She is beautiful, is she not?" asked a voice beside him. And Kevin turned to find Dr. Margaret Cole, the chief engineer of the project, standing with her arms crossed and a proud smile on her face. "What do you call her?" Kevin asked, staring at the sleek lines and the strange engines that seemed to pulse with contained energy. "The Endeavor," Margaret replied, And she is just the first of many. Because by the time we are finished, humanity will have a fleet capable of things the galaxy cannot even imagine. Kevin watched as workers installed the final components of the dimensional drive, a technology so advanced that it made alien faster-than-light systems look like horse-drawn carriages compared to rocket ships. "Do you think they know?" he asked quietly. "The aliens in the blockade? Do you think they have any idea what we are building?" Margaret laughed softly and shook her head. "They think we are trapped in here with them," she said, "when the truth is that they are out there, completely unaware that the universe just got much bigger than they ever dreamed." Back on Earth, Daniel Porter had returned to his family for the first time in 15 years of diplomatic service, and he sat on the porch of his childhood home in Vermont, watching the sunset with his elderly parents, Mother beside him. Was it hard?" she asked, her voice gentle with concern. "Watching them throw you out like that, after everything you did for them?" Daniel thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "No," he finally said, "because I always knew it would end this way, and I spent those 15 years learning everything I could about them, their weaknesses and their fears, their technologies and their secrets." He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "They thought they were getting rid of a problem," he said with a quiet smile, "but they were actually releasing something they will never be able to contain, because humanity was never meant to be a junior partner in someone else's empire." His mother squeezed his hand, and together they watched the darkness fill with stars that would soon belong to humanity alone. In the depths of space, the alien blockade fleet continued their vigilant watch, completely unaware that the species they were containing had already found a door to infinity. 2 years had passed since the banishment, and the Galactic Concord was beginning to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. Trade Ambassador Kyla Morrison had been one of the most skilled negotiators in human history. A woman who could walk into a room full of hostile aliens and walk out with agreements that benefited everyone, and without her steady hand guiding interspecies commerce, the great trading networks were starting to unravel. The Rilthani and the Jexvar, 2 species that had been enemies for 10,000 years, had maintained an uneasy peace through treaties that Kyla had personally crafted. But now those old hatreds were bubbling back to the surface. Border skirmishes became raids, raids became battles, and within 6 months of the human banishment, a full-scale war had erupted in the outer reaches that threatened to drag a dozen other species into the conflict. "We need a mediator," High Arbiter Ziloth announced at an emergency session of the Council. "Someone who can bring the Rilthani and Jexvar to the negotiating table before this war consumes the entire sector." The chamber fell silent, because everyone knew that the only mediators skilled enough for such a task had been banished, along with the rest of humanity. In the medical centers of the inner worlds, another crisis was unfolding that no one had anticipated. Dr. Benjamin Cross had been the leading xenobiologist in the galaxy, a human researcher who had developed treatments for 3 previously incurable diseases that affected alien species, and his departure had left thousands of patients without hope. The Murthari plague, which Dr. Cross had been on the verge of curing, began spreading again through their home system, and the Velkari genetic degradation that his team had stabilized was now accelerating without the ongoing treatments he had developed. Hospital administrators sent desperate messages to the Council to contact the human medical teams, but the blockade remained firmly in place. "We cannot appear weak," argued Council Member Thrin of the Collective, "for if we reach out to the humans now, we admit that we made a mistake." Meanwhile, the communication relay network that connected the galaxy began experiencing failures that no one could fix. Human engineers had designed and maintained 40% of the system, and their departure had left critical gaps in the technical knowledge required to keep everything running. And within 18 months of the banishment, entire sectors had gone dark. Colony worlds found themselves cut off from the rest of civilization, and trade ships got lost in regions where the navigation beacons had failed. And slowly, the great web of communication that held the Concord together began to fray. But all of these problems paled in comparison to what emerged from the darkness between galaxies in the third month of the second year. The Void Harvesters had been the terror of ancient civilizations, a race of beings from beyond known space who swept through star systems and consumed everything in their path. And the last time they had appeared, 300 years ago, it had taken the combined might of every species in the Concord to drive them back. Now they were returning, and their fleet was larger than any records had ever described. Admiral Zeth Kara of the Combined Defense Force stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the tactical display fill with enemy contacts that numbered in the thousands, and he felt something he had not experienced in 2 centuries of military service: fear. All ships, he ordered through the fleet-wide channel, prepare for defensive formation, and may the ancestors watch over us all. The battle that followed was a massacre, with harvester weapons tearing through Concord ships like they were made of paper, and within hours, the defensive fleet had lost a third of its strength without inflicting any significant damage on the enemy. "We cannot hold them," Zeth Kara reported to the Council in a transmission filled with static from damaged communication systems. "And if they break through here, there is nothing standing between them and the core worlds." In the council chamber, panic had replaced the calm confidence that had characterized the banishment vote just 2 years earlier, and delegates screamed at each other in a dozen languages as they tried to assign blame for the catastrophe unfolding in real time. Then the sensors detected something that made everyone fall silent. A tear appeared in space itself, not the familiar distortion of faster-than-light travel, but something entirely new, a wound in reality that glowed with impossible colors. And through that wound emerged a single vessel. The ship was beautiful in a way that defied description, sleek and deadly, and radiating power that the most experienced tacticians could barely comprehend. Advanced Concord sensors could barely comprehend, and it transmitted a single identification signal that made High Arbiter Xyloth's crystalline form go dark with shock. "This is the Endeavor," announced Captain Nathan Brooks through a channel that cut through all interference like it was not there, "representing the United Earth Stellar Navy, and we are here to help." The Harvester fleet, which had been advancing with unstoppable momentum, suddenly changed course to face this new threat, and Nathan Brooks smiled as he saw the enemy finally notice what had arrived. "All hands," he ordered calmly. "Weapons free." What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come, though no one would ever fully understand the technologies that made it possible. The Endeavor moved through the Harvester formation like a predator through a school of fish, her weapons firing beams of energy that caused enemy vessels to simply cease to be. Exist, not destroyed or damaged, but unmade at a fundamental level. In 3 days, a single human ship accomplished what the entire Concord fleet could not: the complete and total destruction of the Void Harvester Armada. When the last enemy vessel had been eliminated, Captain Brooks opened a channel to the stunned survivors of the Concord fleet. "We did not come here for thanks or recognition," he said, his voice carrying across every frequency. "And we did not come to prove a point or demand an apology for our banishment." He paused, letting his words sink into the minds of beings who had just witnessed something impossible. "We came because innocent lives were in danger," Nathan continued, "and humanity does not abandon the innocent, even when they have been abandoned by those they once called friends." The Endeavor turned toward the dimensional rift from which it had emerged, and every sensor in the Concord fleet struggled to understand the energies swirling around that impossible doorway. "You voted to banish us," Nathan said as his ship began to move toward the gateway. And we accepted your decision, but that does not mean we stopped caring about the galaxy we left behind." The last words the Concorde heard from Captain Nathan Brooks were spoken softly, almost gently, as the Endeavour vanished back into whatever realm humanity had discovered. "Good luck out there," he said, "because from where we stand, you are going to need it." The dimensional rift closed behind the human vessel, leaving the survivors alone with the wreckage of an enemy fleet, and the terrible understanding that humanity had become something far greater than anyone had imagined. In the council chamber on Nexus Prime, High Arbiter Xyloth retrieved the data chip that Daniel Porter had left behind 2 years earlier, and he read the message again with new understanding. "You needed us more than you knew," the chip had said, and now, finally, the galaxy was beginning to understand just how true those words had been. 5 years had passed since the day the Galactic Council voted to banish Earth, and in that time, everything had changed. The Great Chamber on Nexus Prime, which had once echoed with confident declarations about containing the human threat, now hosted emergency sessions almost every week, as one crisis after another threatened to tear the Concorde apart. High Arbiter Xyloth had aged visibly, his crystalline form showing cracks and discolorations that came from stress and sleepless cycles. And as he prepared for the most important meeting of his long life, he wondered if the decision they had made 5 years ago would be remembered as the greatest mistake in galactic history. Distrust the council that had cast them out. "Prepare my transport," he ordered, "and gather representatives from the 100 most powerful species, for this will be our only chance to undo what we did." The buffer zone station had been constructed by automated drones in the decades before first contact, intended as a neutral meeting place for species that did not yet trust each other. And it seemed fitting that it would now host the attempted reconciliation between humanity and the galaxy that had rejected them. Ambassador Daniel Porter, now serving as Earth's Secretary of External Affairs, arrived with a small delegation that included familiar faces like Susan Hartley, and new ones like Dr. Margaret Cole, the engineer who had helped build the ships that changed everything. "High Arbiter," Daniel said with a polite nod as the alien delegation entered the conference room. "It has been a long time since we stood in the same room." Xyloth studied the human. "Ambassador, searching for signs of the bitterness or anger that surely must exist after everything that had happened." But Daniel's face showed nothing but calm patience. "Secretary Porter," Xyloth began, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say, "I have come here today to admit something that this council has never admitted before. We made a mistake." The alien delegates behind him shifted uncomfortably, many of them clearly unhappy about hearing their leader speak such words, but Xyloth continued without hesitation. "We judged your species based on fear rather than evidence," he said, "and we allowed that fear to drive us toward a decision that has brought nothing but harm to the galaxy we sought to protect." Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, and Xyloth found himself deeply unsettled by the human's composure. "The Rilthani Jexvar War has claimed 2 billion lives," Xyloth continued, "and our medical systems are failing without your researchers, and our communication networks are falling apart without your engineers. And 3 weeks ago, we were saved from extinction by a single human ship that asked for nothing in return." He paused, gathering his strength for the words that had to come next. "On behalf of the Galactic Council," Xyloth declared formally, "I invite humanity to rejoin the Concorde as a full member, with all rights and privileges restored." The chamber fell silent as everyone waited for Daniel Porter's response. And the human took a long moment before speaking. "I appreciate the honesty of your words," Daniel said finally, "and I believe that you personally mean what you say, but I must decline your invitation." Shocked murmurs rippled through the alien delegation, and Xyloth leaned forward, with confusion clear in his crystalline features. "May I ask why?" he said, struggling to understand how anyone could refuse such an offer, and walked to the viewport that looked out over the stars, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that Susan Hartley recognized from years of watching him face difficult situations. "You did not make a mistake," Daniel said quietly. "For a mistake implies an accident, a momentary lapse of judgment that anyone might make." He turned to face the assembled delegates, and for the first time, something like steel entered his voice. "What you did was a choice," he continued, "a deliberate decision made after 60 years of partnership, 60 years of humans fighting beside you and building with you and sacrificing for you. And when the vote was called, not a single species in this room spoke in our defense." The alien delegates could not meet his eyes, because they knew his words were true. "We shared our technology with you freely," Daniel said, "and we asked for nothing but friendship in return. And we believed that the bonds we built would matter when the time came to judge us." He shook his head slowly, and the disappointment in his expression was somehow worse than anger would have been. "But when fear whispered in your ears, you listened to it, instead of remembering the humans who had worked beside you, healed your sick, defended your borders, and died for causes that were not our own." Council Member Thrin rose from his seat, his composite form shifting with agitation. "What do you want from us?" he demanded. "Name your terms, for surely there must be something that would bring humanity back." Daniel laughed softly, but there was no humor in the sound. "That is what you never understood about us," he replied, "and it is why you feared us so much, because we do not want anything from you." He returned to his seat and looked around the table at beings who had once been colleagues, some of whom had been close enough to call friends. "Humanity intervened against the harvesters because we value life," Daniel explained, "not because we wanted recognition or reward, and we will continue to help the innocent when we can, because that is who we are." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "But we will not return to a council that sees us as a threat to be managed rather than an ally to be treasured," he said, "because trust, once broken, cannot be easily restored." Zilloth made one final attempt, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "Surely there must be some path forward," he pleaded, "some way to rebuild what was lost." Daniel considered the question carefully before responding. "Perhaps someday," he allowed, "when the species of this galaxy can look at humanity and see partners instead of competitors, friends instead of threats, equals instead of dangerous children who need to be controlled." He stood, signaling that the meeting was at an end. "But that day is not today," Daniel concluded, "and it will not come simply because you ask for it, for trust must be earned through actions, not words." The human delegation gathered their things and moved toward the exit, and as they reached the door, Zilloth called out one last question. "Where will you go?" he asked. "What will become of humanity now?" Daniel paused at the threshold and looked back with that same calm smile he had worn 5 years ago in the council chamber. "We will go where we have always gone," he answered, "forward, into the unknown, toward a future that we build with our own hands." Susan Hartley stepped beside him, and together they walked out of the station, leaving behind a room full of beings who were only beginning to understand that some doors, once closed, cannot be opened again, no matter how hard you knock. The buffer zone station hung in the darkness between stars, a monument to the meeting that failed to heal the wounds of the past. And as the human transport departed, Zilloth watched it go, with the terrible knowledge that the galaxy would have to learn to survive without the species they had so foolishly sent away. 10 years had passed since the banishment, and the universe had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Earth had become something more than a planet, more than a homeworld. more than the birthplace of a species that had once been dismissed as aggressive primitives who did not belong among the stars. The dimensional gateways that human scientists had pioneered now connected colonies spread across 12 different planes of existence, each one a universe unto itself, with its own resources, its own challenges, and its own infinite possibilities. Human population had grown from 8 billion to 50 billion, spread across hundreds of worlds that existed in dimensions the Galactic Concord could not even detect, let alone visit. Disease had become a memory, poverty had been eliminated, and the old conflicts that had once divided humanity by nation and race and religion had faded into history, as people worked together to build something greater than anyone had imagined. Historian Dr. Rachel Morrison, daughter of the famous trade ambassador Kyla Morrison, had spent the last 3 years writing the definitive account of what she called the exile period. And as she sat in her study, overlooking the crystal spires of New Geneva, she reviewed the final chapter one last time. In banishing us, she had written, the galaxy freed us, for we had been holding ourselves back, hiding our true potential out of a desire to fit in with species who would never accept us as equals. She paused at the window, watching as a dimensional transport ship rose through the clouds on its way to a colony in what the scientists called Dimension 7, a realm where the laws of physics allowed for structures and technologies that would be impossible in normal space. Free from their restrictions, her book continued, free from their fears, free from their limitations, humanity became what we were always meant to be, not conquerors, but explorers, not warriors, but pioneers, not a threat, but a hope. The Galactic Concord still existed, though it had fractured significantly since the banishment. The HFY War had eventually ended, but not before 12 billion lives had been lost, and 3 entire star systems had been rendered uninhabitable. And the peace that followed was fragile and bitter, held together by exhaustion rather than reconciliation. Diseases that Dr. Benjamin Cross could have cured continued to spread through alien populations, and technologies that human engineers could have perfected remained stagnant. And year by year, the great civilization that had once spanned the galaxy slowly diminished. Some species individually had reached out to Earth in the years following the failed reconciliation. The Murthari, who had suffered so greatly from the plague that human researchers had been close to curing, sent secret envoys to request help, and humanity welcomed them with the same generosity that had once characterized their participation in the Concord. The young Velkari scientist Sithara, who had served as Xyloth's aide during the failed meeting, eventually emigrated to human space, bringing with her knowledge of crystalline technology that combined beautifully with human dimensional science. One by one, individuals and small groups found their way to the human realms, drawn by the promise of a society that valued cooperation over fear, and humanity welcomed them all with open arms. They did not come to join an empire, Rachel wrote, for humanity had not built an empire, but rather a community, a family that stretched across dimensions and welcomed anyone who shared the dream of building rather than destroying. On the 10th anniversary of the banishment, Secretary Daniel Porter stood on the steps of the United Earth Parliament in Geneva, preparing to give an address that would be broadcast across all of human space. He was older now, his hair gray, and his face lined with the years of responsibility he had carried, but his eyes still held the same quiet confidence that had confused the Galactic Council a decade ago. 10 years ago today, he began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd and through the dimensional relays to colonies in distant realms. The Galactic Council voted to banish Earth from their civilization, and I stood before them and accepted their verdict with a smile. The crowd listened in respectful silence, many of them old enough to remember that day, others young enough to have only known life in the expanded human territories. They feared what we might become, Daniel continued. And they were right to be afraid, but not for the reasons they imagined. For they thought we would become conquerors, destroyers, threats to their way of life. He paused, looking out over a city that represented everything humanity had built since the exile. Instead, we became something they never expected, he declared, and we became the greatest builders the universe has ever seen, creators of worlds and architects of dimensions, explorers of realms that existed only in theory before human minds figured out how to reach them. In the crowd, Susan Hartley watched her old friend speak, and she remembered the young diplomat she had served alongside in those difficult years before the banishment. The man who had somehow known that exile would set humanity free. "We have not forgotten the galaxy we left behind," Daniel said, "and we continue to help when we can, sending medical teams to treat diseases and engineering crews to prevent disasters and emergency relief to worlds struck by catastrophe." He smiled, the same smile that had confused so many aliens 10 years ago. "We do this not because we seek to prove ourselves or to shame those who rejected us," he explained, "but because kindness is who we are, and no amount of rejection can change our fundamental." The sun was setting over Geneva, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the dimensional gate rising in the distance like a monument to human achievement. "They tried to isolate us," Daniel said, his voice rising with emotion for the first time, "and instead they liberated us. They tried to diminish us, and instead they made us infinite. They tried to contain our potential, and instead they released it into realms beyond their understanding." He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were appearing, alongside the soft glow of dimensional gateways leading to human colonies and other planes of existence. "The galaxy voted to banish Earth," he concluded, "and humanity smiled and walked away, not because we did not care, but because we knew something they did not." The crowd waited, holding their breath for his final words. "We knew that the universe was bigger than they imagined," Daniel said softly, "and we knew that we would find our place in it, with or without their blessing." He raised his hand in farewell, and 50 billion humans across a dozen dimensions raised their hands in return. "They thought they were closing a door," Daniel Porter said, with a smile that had not changed in 10 years, "but they were actually opening a window to forever." The crowd cheered, and the sound echoed across dimensions, a celebration of everything humanity had become since the day the galaxy tried to make them small. And somewhere in the depths of dimensional space, beyond the reach of any species that had voted for their exile, humanity continued to build, to explore, to dream, and to prove that the greatest gift the galaxy had ever given them was the freedom to become everything they were always meant to be. The stars belonged to those brave enough to reach for them, and humanity had never stopped reaching, not even when the galaxy tried to convince them that they did not deserve to touch the sky.